What is up, guys? Manny here. Welcome back to the channel. In today's episode we're gonna talk about a very interesting subject, namely the perfect genetics for rock climbing. Recently I published a video called The Grade Everyone Can Reach, in which I stated that genetics have actually a pretty big influence on where the lifetime max grade of a certain person resides. And since then I got bombarded with the question, Manny, what are the perfect genetics for rock climbing? If you could design a person, what traits would you give him to give him the ideal genetical makeup for rock climbing? So that's what we're gonna talk about today in this video. It's gonna be probably a pretty long video because the subject is quite complex and interesting, and with all my longer videos you're gonna find some timestamps in the video description down below, and also as well in the comments in case you want to skip some chapters as well. I want to say here that this is all my personal opinion and it's based on my observations and my experience. You might have a different opinion than me. In case that's the case, please feel encouraged to post it down below in the comments as well. I would be glad to read it, and I bet the others would be glad as well to read more opinions than mine. And finally, before we start, I want to say here, don't get too caught up in the genetics chapter. Unfortunately, we cannot change our genetics, as you might know, and that's why you shouldn't be too fanatic about it. But maybe you are a trainer or someone who gets into contact with a lot of new kids or talents or whatever, and you want to recognize the next super talent that is walking by. So I hope that at least for some of you guys out there, this video might be of some use. First of all, how can we define genetically gifted climber? Because people tend to have different opinions on that one already, and I want to rule out any misunderstandings here. So here's how I see it. For me, a genetically gifted person when it comes to climbing is a person who is able to send a great array of outdoor problems with a relatively low effort, excluding things like training effort, excluding starting early, excluding also privilegedness and all the other things that I've talked about before. Now, the reason why we have to talk about outdoor problems in this context is because natural rock doesn't give a damn whether you're genetically suited or not for the sport, whereas indoor problems do very well so, because they are set by humans artificially to suit all competitors equally, which is only fair, of course. And because climbing is so fascinating, it is so simple, simply get to the top without falling, and complex at the same time because we've got so many performance contributors like finger strength, upper arm strength, body tension, dynamics, arm length, body height, gender, and whatnot. The list goes on and on and on. So it's very hard to define a single genetical factor which is going to help you succeed in all the problems, in all the disciplines. Rather, there is a genetical conglomerate which is going to contribute to your performance, and some factors more, some factors less. We're going to talk about this in this video as well. And the way how I see it is that there are three major genetical pillars on which the genetic makeup of any given person for rock climbing is based. And some of them are visible to the naked eye and can therefore be used to estimate the potential of a person walking by, and some of those are invisible and are only unveiled when you see the person actually training or climbing. And the first one of these three main pillars is of course body morphology, and I mean that in a purely geometrical sense. How long are your arms? How long are your legs? What is your body height? What is your body circumference? And stuff like that. And this one is of course obviously visible on sight. And I want to get this one done first as well because it contains the greatest number of subchapters. So let's get it done. And the first trait in this category is, of course, body height. And I've made a whole separate video about this topic already. You can check it out here, where I try to explain why I believe that the ideal height for climbing is actually somewhere around 176 to 178 centimeters or something. Basically because this will give you enough reach to climb 98%, let's say, of the problems, but still allows you to stay quite lightweight at the same time. If you would be taller, you get even more reach, of course, but we also get more heavier, and that's basically a disadvantage. Whereas on the other hand, if you get shorter, you get a lot lighter, but you will also lack some reach here and there, maybe on outdoor problems. So that's basically my reasoning here. A lot of people pointed out, man, you have to talk about ape index and wingspan and all that kind of stuff in this context. That is true, wingspan influences your reach as well, but it is completely independent from body height, and this video was about body height, so I didn't talk about wingspan. which is why I'm gonna talk now about wingspan, which is the second subchapter of body morphology and a quite important one. So first of all, I want to point out that most people get caught up in the ape index wingspan topic with actually overlooking what's important about it, which is arm length. Now, most of you will say, well, arm length, that's basically wingspan, that's basically ape index, so what's the point? Well, ape index and also wingspan depend on both your arm lengths and also your shoulder width. And here's the thing, if you're getting your wingspan predominantly through shoulder width, this is actually not so ideal from a geometrical point of view. Let me explain why. Let's take a look at these two very schematic climbers. Both of them have the same body height and the same wingspan, and therefore also the same ape index. But despite that, they have very different body morphologies, and that is important because, as you can see, the guy with the narrow shoulders has much more of what I would call effective reach than the guy with the wide shoulders. He has more reach from the ground up, he has also more options when it comes to crossing over moves, and he has also advantages in certain undercling situations. Having long arms does not come without a cost though. Most people will now bring up the leverage argument. Short extremities have better leverage than long extremities, and this is true. I would add to that they are probably also preferable when it comes to injury prevention, probably for the same reason. However, this is nothing that couldn't be compensated with strength and the right exercises. We also have to take into account that narrow shoulders are quite a lot lighter than wide ones. So essentially we have to ask ourselves the question here, how much more strength do you need to compensate missing reach versus how much more strength do you need to compensate for the higher leverage? And because it is sometimes simply impossible to compensate missing reach with strength versus a move almost never becomes impossible just because you have longer arms, I would probably go with the longer arms if I had the choice. Also, if we have a quick look at our close relatives who still climb a lot, move around in the trees and stuff, you will see these long funny arms because it gives them such good mobility, it gives them so much reach and options. Here evolution seems to have preferred the long arms over the less ideal leverage as well. Now we have evolved into humans and we climb on rocks, so that comparison is kind of a stretch in the literal sense of the word. I understand that, but I still think that these biomechanical principles apply. Essentially that means that you want to go more for the gibbon look versus the gorilla look. And it is of course not tempting to say, well, more is always better, but this is of course not true. At some point, the additional reach that you get with even longer arms cannot outweigh the worse leverage anymore, and it becomes a disadvantage. But I'd say that an ape index of about like +5 or something and relatively narrow shoulders actually will benefit your climbing in general. Which leads us to the next subchapter of body morphology. Let's talk about legs for a second. Well, it's essentially the same story as with the ape index. It seems to be preferable when your leg length contributes more to your total body height than your torso and head. And the reason why this is the case is simply that this will give you the optimal reach with your legs, given that you have the optimal flexibility, of course, and therefore the greatest number of stepping options. As well, it will make you quite considerably lighter, because legs are lighter than torso. And additionally to that, in certain dino cases, long legs are also quite an advantage because they will allow you to accelerate even more, gain that momentum to push yourself away to that target hold. And on the other hand, we have yet again the leverage argument, but I think all these other factors dominate the leverage argument quite a bit. So long legs in general, compared to your total body height, are quite an advantage in my opinion. And one more thing when it comes to legs, you want to have thin legs, god damn it. Since climbing is such a weight dependent sport, you want to go for chicken legs, simple as that. I mean, there's a lot of weight to save here. Not only is this going to make you lighter overall, but it's also going to drag your center of gravity up, which I think gives you a little bit more control over your body in general on the wall, which you're going to feel, for example, when you swing out in the form of a shorter swinging time, or in very body strength demanding situations in the form of a little bit less effort pulling on those footholds, those far below footholds. However, there are situations where a bit of leg muscle can be useful, for example on extreme hooks and knee bars, like in Adam Ondra's recent Silence where he had to train calves actually to get the most out of these knee bars to make them into no hand rests. And on certain dynos, for example, where you need a lot of acceleration power. However, I would say that thin legs outperform thick, big legs most of the time in climbing. On to the next thing, let's talk about fingers and hands for a second. Well, especially in outdoor climbing, the difficulty is delivered via two main ways. First of all, quality of the holds, and second of all, distance between those holds. And often enough, it's simply the bad outdoor hold that is smaller than the corresponding good outdoor hold. A bad edge is smaller and shallower than a good edge. A bad pocket is smaller and shallower than a good pocket. So here we can see that actually a tendency towards smaller, thinner fingers seems to be more ideal from a genetic point of view than the corresponding big, thick fingers which do not fit into these small holes simply. Shorter fingers will also deal with these small holes better from a leverage point of view, which is not only good when it comes to force transduction from the forearm into the fingertips, but also when it comes to injury prevention in the structures of the fingers. And this is actually also a widely accepted advantage of female climbers over male climbers, and also very young climbers over adult climbers. Two more things need to be said here. First of all, there are also holds out there where big fingers and hands are an actual advantage. I'm thinking about slopers and pinches here, for example, although they seem to be a little bit less frequent than the classical small crux hold. But that of course depends on the area you're climbing in. And secondly, more rigid and thick fingers should theoretically have an advantage when it comes to finger injury prevention, although you might not be able to fit them so perfectly in the small crux edges or small crux pockets. The inner structures of the fingers should be theoretically able to resist the strong forces that come across when climbing better. But on the other hand, more rigid and thick fingers usually carry also more rigid and thick bodies, and this could again diminish this advantage or even outweigh it. Moral of the story, there are holds out there which feel like jugs to some people and like crux edges to other people, not only because of differences in finger strength, but also because of differences in finger size and hand size. Therefore, I would say that a generally smaller, thinner, more flimsy build of hands and fingers seems to be preferable for rock climbing. Back to the top of any climber, the head. Now, the head is a very important tool when it comes to climbing, as we're going to see at a later point, but in a sense of body morphology, it's all about the weight. So I was quite astonished to see that the human head weighs in between 3 and 5 kilograms, and you obviously want to go for the 3 kilograms if you can to save 2 kilograms of weight here. So there are of course certain differences between genders as well, and between adolescents and adults here to consider. I didn't get the exact numbers out here, but in a sense of being as lightweight as possible, you want to have a lightweight head. Simple as that. So now that we've covered the single parts, let's take a look at the body as a whole. Let's take a look at body types and genders. Now I'm pretty sure that you've heard from classical sports theory that there are these 3 human body types, like the ecto, meso and the endomorph. And although I find that quite generalizing and quite inaccurate, I personally like to distinguish 5 human types, but that's another story. Let's roll with that. Let's assume that every human falls under one of these categories, ecto, meso and endomorph. Then we would see, from what we've heard so far, that the ideal climber falls definitely somewhere in between the ecto and the mesomorph, with a definitive tendency towards the ectomorph. Simply because this body type will allow you to have the greatest possible reach and the lightest possible weight at the same time. When it comes to gender, we still see a slight performance gap between male and female athletes, which by the way got recently a bit smaller thanks to Angie Eiters sending the first female 9B La Planta de Shiva in Spain. Huge congrats to that, really impressive. And yeah, I personally think that this performance gap is not due to that women are a lot weaker in the strength to weight ratio department, although they have disadvantages there because they have to carry more, in a sports sense, unproductive tissue, which is actually a good thing in my humble opinion. But anyway, despite that, by the way, we see that women are a lot lighter, But anyway, what women definitely are is they are a lot shorter than the compared male athletes, and they also tend to have shorter extremities as a proportion of their total body height, which all in all gives them a lot less reach. And as I have mentioned in previous videos, I think that this is actually the main contributor to the still existing performance gap between male and female climbers. Anyway, all in all, we can say that you have a slight edge in climbing from a genetic point of view if you simply belong to the male gender. Alright, that's roughly it when it comes to geometrical body morphology. We can finally move on to the second big, very important pillar of genetics for rock climbing, something I'd call muscle texture or muscle character. This one is only to a little extent visible on sight compared to geometrical body morphology, and I'm glad it only has 2 sub-chapters, so this video is not going to be 3 hours long or so. Awesome. So first we have to talk about the quality of the muscle in a fibrous and neuronic way. This topic first got my attention when I heard about studies which found an extreme variability in finger and hand strength amongst relatively untrained young individuals, suggesting a strong genetic component. And it's a rare case on this channel, but I'm actually going to show you some scientific results to prove my point here. This is a relatively old paper published in 1986, accessible on the internet. I'm going to post some kind of link or something down below, with the very simple goal to evaluate hand and finger strength amongst adolescents. So what they did was they measured different kinds of pinches and other stuff amongst 231 males and 240 females in different age categories and calculated mean values. These are not interesting for us now, basically. Essentially, older ones were stronger than younger ones and boys were stronger than girls, so there were no big surprises there. But look at that range and look at that standard deviation. For those who are not so familiar with statistics, these values indicate how spread out the sample is. So basically, the greater the variability amongst single individuals, single data points, the higher your standard deviation is going to be, and the range is simply the highest minus the lowest value of your sample. And as you can see, amongst boys, the weakest values are relatively consistently about 3 times smaller than the strongest, and amongst girls, weakest values are about half the strongest. Essentially, that means that there is a huge genetic component involved in finger strength, which is, in my opinion, the biggest muscular contributor to climbing performance. Now, whether this variability is due to differences on a fibrous level, maybe you've heard about fast twitch versus slow twitch muscle fibers before, or differences in innervation of the tissue, suggesting differences in intramuscular coordination, we don't really know, and it doesn't really matter. What matters is that if you're lucky, you reside in the higher values of finger strength to begin with, which might as well enable you to train your fingers to the level of the high-end athletes of today. And by the way, these findings are probably not only relevant to forearm muscles, but also applicable to some extent to the rest of the body, to upper arms, upper body, which play a role in climbing as well, as we know. Of course, you have to take into account that some of these kids are already more developed than others, and some are probably also a lot heavier than others, which puts the differences kind of into perspective. But despite that, we can still see the differences in the 18 to 19-year-old guys, where everyone should be more or less developed. So these findings are very significant in my opinion. On to the second subchapter of muscle quality, and that one I'd call muscle attachment. This one is a very subjective observation of mine, so I don't know how important that one really is, but I have the impression that high-performance climbers usually have these deep, long muscle attachments. It's kind of hard to explain, that's why I'll simply show you some pictures. It's kind of the opposite of what is preferred for bodybuilding, where you want well-separated muscle bellies, so to say. It's especially dominant on the brachioradialis and the latissimus, and I think it gives those climbers very good leverage and also mobility in the corresponding joints, both of which are of course beneficial for climbing performance. Now the question arises to what extent these characteristics are due to genetics or simply a result of the training and the climbing itself, and starting early of course. With the finger strength, it seems quite obvious that there is this variability from the beginning. With the attachment thing, I personally found too that some people new to the sport and still not particularly strong already have these deep attachments, especially when they are a bit on the taller side actually, while others who are long into the sport still lack that, which suggests yet again a genetic component which is at work here. Got a different opinion or experience? Post it down below. That's all I have to say about muscle qualities. Time to move on to the third and last pillar of genetics for rock climbing. Let's come back to the head, let's talk about the mind. Extremely important for climbing performance and often underrated. I'd like to divide it into two subchapters, the first one being feeling for the movement. Now, I don't know how experienced you are with coaching and stuff, but when you work a lot with beginners and children, you will quickly find that there is a minority amongst these peoples who have kind of a natural feel for the sport. They move in a relatively elegant way on the wall from the beginning. They hit their footholds, they develop technique almost on and from alone, and it's like everything falls into place naturally. This is often called talent, although for me personally talent also includes all the other genetic components in a more comprehensive sense. And although this difference amongst beginners definitely exists, the question arises again, how much of it is really genetics? Is it maybe just that these children got to play more on the playground when they were really young and have thus a better feel for their body in general, or maybe they always did some kind of sports in their adolescent times? In my opinion, as a biologist, more of this is actually genetics than what the current consensus seems to be. But in fact, it's very hard to tell, and this is also true for the second subchapter of the mind, which is simply character of the person. Let me give you one example. Some people are just on the thrillier side. They like to take risks, they like to challenge themselves, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, we've got the security people who don't like to take risks, who don't like to experience the thrill, who are not addicted to it, so to say, who clinch more to their comfort zone. Now, who do you think will overcome his fear of falling quicker and might even enjoy it at some point? Another thing is patience. Whether you're genetically gifted or not, it's going to take time to progress in climbing, and some people tend to turn away from sports quickly when they don't get the results they desire instantly. On another level, a limit project is not sent in one day, especially not on the high-end level. How willing are you to persist? Do you still enjoy it after falling at the crux move for over 50 times? Are you someone who enjoys the grind? These are, amongst many others, some character traits which greatly influence where a person ends up in their climbing career. And it is of course debatable how much of this is genetics and how much is education. In my opinion, there is a genetic component involved here as well, and this is why I wanted to include these topics into this video. That's basically it for the genetics of the mind, so to say, so let's wrap everything up here real quickly, then I'll let you go. We've got first the three main pillars of genetical predisposition in rock climbing: the geometrical body morphology, body height, relative length of extremities, hands and fingers, the lightweight head, and of course the body type. Then we've got muscle quality, the second pillar, with good fiber composition and innervation, especially in the forearms, and a nice deep muscle attachment. And then we've got the mind, with a natural feel for the sport and of course the character of the person. And that's about all I've got on the topic of perfect genetics for rock climbing. I could go into more detail on some stuff, but I won't do it because this video is already too long anyway. Please don't forget to not get too hung up on the genetics chapter, because ultimately we cannot change our genetics. We all have to work with what we've got, so try to have fun with it. And of course don't forget to train your ass off and basically see where you end up. Thank you guys so much for watching this long ass video. I really appreciate it. I would also appreciate it if you would drop your opinions and experiences in the comments down below, as well as leaving a like. If you've got something from this video, it helps a lot. Thank you guys so much for watching again, and I think I'll see you soon in the next one. Stay strong, keep crushing, bye.